going. Here we go. Welcome to the very first Everyday Psych Victims Project live stream. How wonderful it is to be here today. My name is Daryl Brown. I will be chairing today. I grew up in Eugenics mental health institutions of brainwashing, drugs, and diagnosing in the 2000s. I bear the scars to date today. I speak out against the permanent sexual disablement from the so-called mental health drugs and submit videos and content as a team member of the Everyday Psych Victims Project. You can find out more about me at runagainstcastration.com. We marked the first live stream with the creation of May the 19th, the International Awareness Day for Informed Consent. Our guests that will be joining us today are Christina, a psych victim, the founder of the Everyday Psych Victims Project. Christina discovered the dark side of social Darwinism eugenics when she was restricted the civil liberty of attending her university and imprisoned and forced drugged without trial by the signature of the professional alienists. You can find the Everyday Psych Victims Project on Facebook or hit subscribe right here to follow the movement, an official website where human victims of the mental health industry can interact and submit their stories is currently being developed. And Tim Alexander, a filmmaker, creator of the new upcoming documentary Legal Death in Drugs We Trust. Tim is an established LA filmmaker who became aware in this subject after personal experience of out-of-character psych drug-induced violence affecting his family circle, the like of what I experienced as a prepubescent child on psych drugs. Throw your support behind Legal Death in Drugs We Trust, the documentary, at legaldeath.com or follow on Facebook, facebook.com/legaldeath. And we also have Neil Sanders, an author, here today, the author of Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Mind Control, Mass Manipulation and Perception Management, and Welcome to Sell, The Dark Art of Marketing. Neil Sanders became interested in coercive marketing when studying at university. Although not an experienced psych victim, I believe it invaluable to have, communicate and share with a wide range of experiences. Neil has researched into some of the key figures and linked institutions that created the worldwide foundation spread of the newly termed mental health industry and psychology. You can find out more about Neil Sanders and buy his books at neilsandersmindcontrol.com. And we also have Julie, a psych victim and a long-term activist. Julie is a summa cum laude graduate, one of the rarest forms of educational graded awards, whose bright paths were shelved after coming into contact with therapy or psychology, and her brutal descent into brain electroshock, drug slavery, and brainwashing abuse from mental health industry imprisonment, an all too familiar story. She has been an activist to expose the indoctrination for a long time. Please support her and find out more at juliemadblogger.com. Would anybody like to add to their introductions or amend corrections? Or forever hold your peace?
That sounds good to me.
I'll press ahead with the topics then, if everybody is okay with their introductions. The overview of topics that we'll be discussing today are the nature of the beast, hot topics in the news and history, and finally, taking action and moving forward. For the format of this show, I'll be asking the guests their opinions individually, as well as opening up for group discussions. This may vary or change in fluidity, depending on the nature of some questions, as we are privileged with the attendances of very experienced, talented and motivated guests with different projects. The first question on the nature of the beast will be put individually to our guests. What happened to you? What are your experiences? Or how did you get here? Christina, would you like to start?
All right, so as the founder of Everyday Psych Victims Project, I started this in August of 2016. And so what happened is that in fall 2014, I first became a psych victim by Texas Christian University, and I didn't realize that they had a history of MK Ultra, and I didn't even know that was called by then. So basically, well, I'll say the name, Amanda Swartz went there and said, because I tried to make, like, basically it wasn't really a true report of a break-in, because I just was irritated with some people I was talking to back then I shouldn't have contacted. And so then they told me to go to the counseling center. I never was into counseling. I was kind of anti-psych my entire life. Like, I look at the book and look at the classes and like, wow, anybody can be diagnosed with all of these things at any point in time and different ones, because it's this regular emotions and experiences, natural reactions. So what happened is that Amanda Swartz went there at TCU and claimed she was a therapist or whatever, and then claimed, oh, electrical signals to your brain from, well, the person one of the people I was complaining about. And so I didn't really, that freaked me out. And then they wanted to put me into a place. So, and I had no history or anything either. And like, they didn't care about grades or GP or scholarships. I even had like a lawyer, the only one I could ever get this entire time, like try to get me not to go to a place and just go to class. Like, and they kicked me off campus and all that. And so 7 days I wasn't drugged then, but I was later. And then what happened is that, you know, they try to diagnose with paranoia or whatever. And of course, like, I didn't know about any of that stuff, what I was not supposed to say or what I was supposed to say in any way, you're just wrong. So, and then 3 months later, I had it was calm. Like, I tried to go to CNA class and dropped out of that because I didn't like their standards. And then I even tried a medical online, like just a free class from Stanford, medical education in Millennium, and I did that. And I even got a research position at CSU, Chico, for that, like for studying avian flu. And so everything seemed calm, but I was still freaked out. Like, is this the government or something with electrical signals?
Was that after the mental health industry kidnapped you and took you out of school?
So it was 7 days. Yeah, they required 7 days, and apparently there was another student there too, but it was just recommended. Like, they weren't forcibly kicked off campus or anything. And then there was another one too. So then I started to see the reality of that, which is creepy. Like, they could just put anybody in psych wards. I thought maybe like 3 estate and maybe the most like dangerous people, because I thought it was like prison, because, you know, I was like, my view was one flew over a cuckoo's nest, or like, oh, these are natural reactions, this is, you know, barbaric or something. But anyway, so 7 days, and they also contacted, yeah, and then they wanted to keep me, that was how.
Can I move on so we can get through to everybody? But yeah, that's how you got involved, and how you got here today and set up the Everyday Psych Victims Project.
2015, then M-filter stuff like burning blood. It was weird for 2 weeks, but anyways, yeah. Next person.
Julie, would you like to explain a little bit of what your experience? How did you get here?
My involvement with the mental health system, brainwashing system, began a year after I started having eating difficulties, which basically started with a diet, and then I couldn't stop with the dieting cycle. My choice to go to therapy was entirely voluntary. I went because it seemed to be a brand new thing in 1981, something that was not commonly done. Mental health was not a household word back then. Depression was not a household word. Eating disorders were unheard of. I had not heard of eating disorders. I had not heard of, I didn't know that if you start to go on an extreme diet, what's going to happen is you won't be able to stop, and that's not a mental disorder. It's just you can't stop dieting and you have to stop the cycle. You don't have to go to therapy for it, actually. You just have to become aware that extreme dieting isn't very safe. But unfortunately, I got caught up in the therapy routine. And of course, therapy doesn't work for it if the therapy doesn't even recognize what your real problem is. So 3 months of therapy didn't help. And then I decided, why don't I try something else? I moved in with my parents, and they didn't know what to do. They were kind of overwhelmed. And at the advice of a family friend who, I don't blame her, she recommended a day treatment program. I remember going there and having no clue that they didn't treat eating problems. I didn't know. to the tune of $50 a day, which was a lot of money back then. I started going there. It added up, and I began to realize they didn't treat my problem. I was the only college-educated person there, except for the staff, but they didn't study music. And I was the only Jew there, interestingly. I found that as time went on, people started talking about these things called depression, manic depression, symptoms. I had never heard of these things. It was 1981 still. And they continued to talk about these terrible childhoods. And I said, uh-oh, I didn't have a terrible childhood. As a matter of fact, mine was pretty good. And they continued to go on and about these absolute nightmare horror stories. And I got caught up in it. I started to think, what am I doing here? Unfortunately, it rubbed off on me. I started to wonder what disorder I must have, since they weren't recognizing anything. The months rolled on, and my eating problems certainly weren't getting any better because they weren't addressing it. My parents were shelling out the bucks. By the time I left there, they'd paid, I know in the UK this doesn't compute, but $10,000, which was an awful lot of money by 1982. I had gotten significantly worse with my eating problem, which was not addressed. It was a crime, and that's how I got indoctrinated. I was talking illnesses, I was talking symptoms, I was talking about coping skills, all the mental health lingo, and yet I didn't have those problems. It's very sad. Thank you.
Neil, could I ask how you got interested in coercive marketing? And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I studied psychology at degree level, basically. So, but also I did a strange course which allowed me to do some semesters of psychology and some semesters of like media production, and that sort of like dips into like advertising and stuff like that. And basically, one of the things that I really noticed straight from the sort of off was there was an sort of weaving of these two disciplines. And basically, I don't think that quite a lot of people understand quite how well studied reaction, stimuli, response, that type of thing is, group mechanisms, and sort of aspirational traits and that type of thing. It is really, really sort of honed and sort of utilized in advertising, basically. So that's how I got interested in that sort of sphere. Sort of the relevance to today is probably because sort of from that, I mean, I'm also a clinical hypnotherapist. So I continue sort of an interest in all sort of aspects of psychiatry, but also I became interested in what might be called the sort of conspiratorial side of it, which is essentially MK Ultra and various other uses of psychology and psychiatry for sort of more nefarious terms. And certainly in the during the First and Second World War, during the sort of 20s and 30s in Russia and China and Korea, the UK, Germany, and America throughout the 50s, for UK and America, were experimenting on people to see if they could coerce them in different ways. And fundamentally, it fell into sort of four categories. It was the search for truth serums, the ability to withstand interrogation. The third is very, very broad. It goes into sort of the utilization of various different druggings or devices or manipulative techniques to gain control over a person, or to put voices in their head, or to in some way mimic the symptoms of some sort of mental disorder or illness in order to manipulate and control them. And then the fourth aspect isn't really connected. Well, it kind of is. It connected to this is sort of propaganda or defining societal norms and that type of thing. So that's really, I suppose, what would be my connection to this type of thing. And basically, one of the facts that is absolutely true is that, particularly during the American phase of testing, they were utilizing people in mental hospitals. They were going to often the very, very cream of the crop of doctors, because these were the people who had the insight. And it's debated as to why these people got involved in this, whether they felt that it was for a greater good, or whether they just, you know, felt that they were superior or whatever. But you've got people like Ewan Cameron, who's actually operating in Canada, and various other people like Sidney Gottlieb and William Sargent in the UK. And there were lots and lots of experiments that were performed against people's will to ostensibly cure things like depression, but actually this was a cover for government experimentation on human beings. So unfortunately, this type of thing does actually happen, or has been proven to happen in the past.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. We just have Tim come live. Tim, I was asking people, what are your experiences, or how did you get to being aware of the mental health or pill industry?
Well, I did it. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm a little late to the party. I had a hard time connecting. I was trying to do it from the phone. I had to go online on my laptop. Anyway, my cousin got married to a childhood friend of mine that I've known since I was 9. And a month and a half after marriage, he started acting erratically. Nobody understood what it was. A month after that, he went up to her job, her school, and shot a child, killed her, and killed himself. I quickly put 2 and 2 together. People are still scratching their head as to why did it happen. Excuse me. I didn't appreciate my childhood friend being known as a San Bernardino killer. So I had PTSD. They found 2 full bags of medication. So I quickly figured out the medication has something to do with it. And I did some research and I unfolded everything. Now I'm doing probably the documentary series on how bad the situation is. And, you know, it blindsided me. I wasn't looking to understand this. I had no knowledge of it. I had no reason to understand it. But it became so apparent to me that I felt like I had to tell everybody what I see.
Thank you. I want to move on to the first question, which is mental health related to eugenics? And I want to open this up to as a group to anyone who would like to start or join in on that question.
I definitely think it's eugenics. So, for example, whenever, like, since there's this whole bias against, you know, turning natural reactions into an illness, then if you show it like a weakness or whatever, but it's not a weakness. So upon that, so if you go around and you tell people that, then you start to get isolated and ostracized, right? From people. Like I lost tons of connections. I was reported and all that. Upon that, there are some even jobs where like they'll ask for psych evals for genetic, like let's say if you're donating, you know, something for reproduction or something, and then so then they'll actually psych eval, and if you show anything from the past from that, then obviously they're not going to even let you in or reproduce, have the option of doing that. So that's definitely shows eugenics. And then upon that, we had the interview before that Daryl did of that, you know, North Carolina eugenics board survivor, who actually, you know, they said, oh, you're not fit, so, you know, take it away. But obviously, you know, it was based off other things like probably racism or classism, probably classism too. And of course, Daryl also had the problem where the psych drugs were, will cause you to have sexual dysfunction. So that's another thing. And of course, they'll just ignore all of it. They'll be like, oh, the benefits outweigh the adverse effects, and that's not true. Like, there's always this kind of marketing. It's a huge marketing of medical trafficking, really, and they're just turning all of this into dependency. It's definitely, I would say it's definitely eugenic. And upon that, they'll call homeless people or poor people or anybody who goes through any adversity, let's say it's from their relatives or from a situation they went through or anything, and they'll be like, oh, that person is now defunct, that they're just naturally reacting to what happened to them and their situation. And they'll be like, oh, that they're adverse. But so it's like, if you go through any kind of problem in your life ever, then you're just going to be marked off as a psych victim, or their terms, their patient or layperson. So then that's another eugenic thing. It's a social Darwinism like subject. That's my opinion.
Thank you. I just want to, I don't know if I've told Tim before, but that, like, when whatever happened to me as a child, I just whatever normal experiences that they saw as abnormal. When I went on the drugs made me emotionally out of character and violent. So they really could call me the psychiatric terms of what they were calling me even easier, because their drugs actually made me emotional and out of character and violent and arguing with everybody. I definitely wasn't myself, as well as the permanent sexual damages it has caused me. If anyone would like to jump in on that question before I move on to the next one, please.
I could add something. I see around me mental patients, if you'll forgive the term, being ghettoized. If you want to, for instance, get housing based on your being stuck on disability, which is here in this country, the payments are so low you cannot, in most regions, you can't live on it. You will have to apply for subsidized housing. Unfortunately, what happens is, in many regions, you can't get into regular subsidized housing. You have to go into mental health housing. In other words, they're separate. And all the subsidized housing, there's housing over that direction, there's housing over that direction. It's a separate entity. It's a separate area. The housing over there has a fence around it, and it's an entirely separate neighborhood. And in this country, they call it the projects. It's literally an enclosed slum, a ghetto for poor people and the mental health ones. It's a ghetto for mental patients. The halfway houses, they're ghettos for mental patients. Mental hospitals are set on hills, set apart.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next question, which is psychology a grooming process for people to end up on drugs? And
can you define grooming? I'm not familiar with that term.
Grooming as in when somebody uses another method to try and convince somebody that they should do this, or believe in something that that belief could end up being on drugs. So my question would be, is psychology a grooming process for people to end up on drugs?
It can be. The thing is, right, well, you've got to make the distinction between psychiatry, which is the proliferation of drugs to solve mental disorders, psychology, which is the supposed science behind the mind and examining it. And it varies across the board. You've got some psychiatrists who believe historically and today that basically drugs are the only answer, and you've got some people that believe that drugs are completely not the answer, and are actually counter to psychology. For example, there is a school of thought that suggests that SSRIs don't actually cure depression; they simply mask symptoms. So there are certain psychologists that would argue against the use of any drugs. There are also certain psychiatrists that would argue against the use of distinct drugs. But this is all very, very muddied because basically you've got industries going on here as well. You've got two very, very sort of prevalent industries there. You've got the health industry and you've got the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, and they're in it to make money, and so the waters become incredibly, incredibly muddied because of that. So sometimes, yes, there is a problem where essentially you've also got to make the distinction between a good therapist and a bad therapist, right? Somebody that basically it takes care or bothers to sort of understand your circumstance, and somebody that just wants you to either shut up or become more useful. And so you get the point where essentially, particularly in England, where people who have any type of mental health often don't have the facilities or the money to have anything like cognitive behavioral therapy, hypnotherapy, anything like that, that is not intrusive in a pharmacological sense. And so they go to their GP, and their GP will just basically say, shut up, take this, because they don't have the time or, frankly, the knowledge of the circumstances, the patient's circumstance, or even actually the drugs, to make an informed decision. Furthermore to that, you've also got the problem where basically weaning people off these drugs once they're actually on it. And so you certainly do get a circumstance where people are in a situation where it would be painful, or it would be very, very unpleasant to go through withdrawal symptoms to come off drugs. So it's a very complicated question. I don't think it's a yes or no, but I could certainly point out numerous occasions where, rather than help somebody, the end result has been that the person is on drugs, and whether that's been actually helpful or not is entirely another argument as well. So it's a complicated issue.
Thank you. I want to move on to the next question, which is what effect? Sorry, Tim, did you want to? Yeah.
Step in. I'm on the road. I'm shooting a 10-part, 10-hour docu-series, Legal Death and Drugs We Trust. I currently had to pull over on the side of the highway to check in, as I said I would. My involvement is very different. I'm coming in very accurately, very focused. I'm finding out new things every single moment. I'm getting people's actual testimonies, their actual stories. I'm getting research. I mean, I've got just scads and scads of research. I want to unveil the truest snapshot of everything that's going on. And I want to do it neutrally without necessarily having the personal experience that some people can say has soured me. So I want to be very careful about the way, I frame what I'm doing to say, this is what I found. So I'm in full support and fully understand everything that you're going through as much as I can, considering I haven't gone through it. So I mainly want to come in and say, I'm with you. I want to create something to voice for everybody across any medication class, so they can finally say, I've been trying to understand what I met my boss. This is what I've gone through. This person gone through. So I have to get back on the road. We're out here more individual. We're dealing with all the classes of drugs, the SSRIs, SRNIs, stimulants, antidepressants, antipsychotics, Z drugs, gabapentin, opioids, even statin, antibiotics. Every possible rock. We even found that ammonium AD, which is for diarrhea, has been
Tim, the sound is very, very, very bad. We're only getting small chops of what you're saying. I don't
keep going back on the road. I just wanted to come in as I said, and just show my support. Making something I want everybody to be benefited by. So I have to get back to my next interview. I just want to come in and say, hey, I'm down with everything you're doing.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you.
How can people best support you and the documentary?
Go to Legal Death Facebook page, Legal Death on Facebook, or legaldeath.com, and you can join up the Facebook, group I have. If you want to be interviewed, you can contact me. I've got a Indiegogo campaign, and any support, any stories. I need whatever a person feels can help this, endeavor is appreciated. We're not begging or asking for anything. We'll take whatever resources we can get because we're trying to get to the finish line for everybody.
Thank you, Tim. If people can throw the weight behind this, because somebody's got to do something about it. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. We'll move on to the next question for people, which is, in your opinion, what effect will the latest implementation or expansion of drugging children in schools called mental health first aid have on children and the future?
It's definitely a negative effect. Sorry. Do you want to go, Neil, or should I just go?
Oh, no, I was sorry. I was just asking, what is that? Because I'm not familiar with it, I'm afraid.
In the UK, there was an announcement maybe about a year or more so ago now. They've invested, I don't know, $1 billion or a lot of money. It was probably going to happen through any political party, but it was Theresa May that announced it at the time, that they're investing in mental health. There was a big announcement on the radio and TV, and the actual project that they're spending they're mostly targeting is putting trained mental health first aiders, in the words they use, into every classroom in the school system in the UK. And they're going to be picking out and looking for children to feed into the mental health industry right at the school classroom level. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on what effect that might have on children and the future.
It's a terrible effect. So obviously, well, Julie knows too. But
well, no, I
definitely,
don't know. I don't know. Actually, I was not taken into the mental health system as a child. I went voluntarily. I was 23 years old. I went fully volunteer. I went to a therapy session. Of course, you never go voluntarily into a psychiatric facility, but I made the decision to go to therapy, and it just completely disappointed me. It completely wasn't what I thought it would be, and they didn't solve anything. But that was decades ago. I was not psychiatrist. Actually, I was psychiatrized as a child, but psychiatry wasn't what it is now. I was not drugged. It was noticed that I was not behaving well. My parents they had me talk to a counselor. This is really cool. They had me talk to a counselor, and then they sent me to a real bona fide psychiatrist who was not a person he never diagnosed me with anything. This is what he did. He talked to me for a while. He found out I had a trauma as a young child that was unresolved. We talked about it, and that was it. I was sent back into the classroom with everything resolved. That was it. That was all that happened. Why doesn't psychiatry do some things like that? I never had a diagnosis. He didn't diagnose.
He didn't diagnose you, and he didn't give you drugs, you mean?
No, he did not diagnose me. He didn't put me in a separate class. He didn't put me into a program. He talked to me for a few sessions, and that was it. He tried to understand what was going on, and he figured it out. I believe he figured it out correctly, and that was it. That was it. It was very short term, and I know I was already singled out, but the singling out happened way before that. It was happening because I was Jewish, because I was the shortest kid in the class, because I was younger, because I was smart. There were many reasons why I was teased by the other children, but what was going on at that time was happening because of a specific trauma, and he helped me resolve that. And it was very short term. I'm not trying to dichotomize good therapist and bad therapist here. I'm not saying there are good therapists out there. They're all on a bell curve. They're on a continuum. Nor am I saying all therapists are good and you only have to find the right one. I'm not saying that either. Nor am I saying therapy is good and drugs are bad. I think most therapists truly suck. And I think there are very few that are worth their salt. And I think when a therapist abuses you, it's not because it was a bad match. It's because abuse is completely illegal, completely unethical, and they don't know what they're doing. They cross boundaries and they shouldn't, and they think they can get away with it. But as far as children goes, yeah, they can get away with it with kids because they can just discredit the child. I don't think children should be singled out, period. I don't think they should be classified. I don't think they should be taken out of the classroom. I don't think they should be labeled. No one should label a child simply because children act the way they do for reasons. Children are all different. They should be appreciated for their variety, for their talents, for their gifts, for their way they're just so funny. Thank you.
Right. I think so. What you were saying, we should spotlight the strengths of the people. So that's another thing that's the issue. If you're sitting there and, in my opinion, mental health or mental hygiene is what it was called for decades, and in some places it still is that they're spotlighting weaknesses of people. So instead of focusing on the situation, what happened, they're sitting there and calling it a trauma. So I don't like that word because they even do use that in certain experiments to manipulate people, and they'll focus on the weakness instead of the people doing it. So instead of focusing, so we'll see a lot of these shootings and things, and they'll say that they were bullied or they're on now psych drugs because of that. So what happening, instead of focusing on the perpetrators and the bully or the situation that's oppressive, they're then focusing on the person. And so that what happens is, I call it internalization. So then they internalize what's happening. It's like something wrong with them forever and they can't change it. It's not external from outside of them.
There isn't always a perp, Christina. It's not, a trauma might be a house fire.
All right, but then that's the issue, is the house fire, in my opinion. So
well, it's not the fault
of,
the perp isn't the fire. There isn't a human perp, is what I'm saying. The fire might be something you fear, or the fire came after you, but the fire isn't a human perp that they're gonna, unless there was an actual person that set the fire isn't something they're going to put in prison and go after for having traumatized you. I mean, you shouldn't be punished for having a trauma on one hand, but there isn't a perp.
Well, and when I'm using perpetrator, I mean the instigator or the thing that caused it. I don't have to mean, I can mean it metaphorically. It's what caused it externally. But another issue is that, so in campuses, they're trying to increase it all the time. So they're trying to make people, instead of talking to their friends, they talk to the therapist or the counselor instead of each other. And that's another problem. I think it's very bad. It causes a culture of silence so that you can't sit there and talk about what's happening to you or what's issue. You can't talk at work. You get fired. You can't talk at school. They could refer you to care, or like crisis response team, or they could refer you to judicial affairs even. So if you have like let's say you go through a crime and then you are affected by it, then they could sit there and report you. The teachers are required at CSUs, if you have a sexual like assault or harassment or something, they'll report you to judicial affairs, and then you're going to get stuck into a mental health program. And that's another issue too. So then now they're focusing on the victim instead of who caused it or what caused it. So it doesn't always have to be literally, when I use that word, I mean just from the outside. And so instead of focusing on who or what is causing it, you're then focusing on the victim, so then they can't move past it and use actions against it. And a lot of times they also are not going to refer them to get any criminal legislation or legal help from that. So they're just going to sit there and talk to them and focus on their emotions. And then of course, then there's the drugging, because they're claim there's a chemical imbalance and there isn't. And a lot of people they really think that. So they sit there and they take the drug and they think that's a balance, instead of how could they have made it not lengthen, and then they could go down again, right? Because it's not actually going to get rid of the issue. It's not teaching them how to deal with the issue or, use actions or externalization. So, I created motivationology.org. That's just a theory, but honestly, and then they're going to sit there and they put these flags of people self-deathing. I call it self-death, so suicide on campus or off campus, and it's not going to help them because they can't talk to each other. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to ask about a figure who was very involved in the switch to, I don't know, maybe what's called mental health that used to be called mental hygiene, and a lot to do with the foundation from my research into what is now psychology and the Tavistock and what they call mental health and psychiatry and the drug. And I want to pick Neil's brains for a moment and ask you what you know about Sir John Rawling Rees, who was he founded the World Federation on Mental Health, and the Tavistock, he was their chief, a lot of changes as well. Yeah, and I was wondering what you know about that character.
Initially, what they're involved with was trying to treat, on the surface, they were trying to treat shell-shocked soldiers, like the people that had come back from the trenches and suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and sort of catatonic states and that type of thing. What it looks like they're actually doing, though, was they were using some of this fodder, so to speak, to sort of examine the what would happen if you sort of traumatize people. What's the breaking point of man? How can you manipulate people, and how can this be used for your own ends? And I think this is the problem, that basically a lot of the horror stories of psychiatry and psychology come from very, very sort of lauded professionals, because it was seen as a cover, basically, and aside from which, basically, these are the most technologically proficient in their particular field, and so they were the people that were on the cutting edge, so to speak, and were able to do this. Rawling Rees, he basically took this concept of trauma and sort of kind of applied it to civilization to an extent. Basically, what he and basically off the back of like the work of Hugh Crichton-Miller and stuff, who was in the Tavistock Institute, Rawling Rees was able to expand the Tavistock facility into looking at sort of social psychology as well. And what shock troops essentially do is they go out and they sort of input the concept of Tavistock's societal structure into the world through places like MIT and Wharton School of Economics, and basically it's a sort of drip down authoritarian view that can be sort of implemented into society, so that people think that this is the way that things work. The prime sort of face thing was to create social turbulence and fluidity. And fluidity is essentially it's chaos. It's the importation and this sort of constant overbearing of the psyche with trauma from an external point of view, be that stress from work, be that financial hardship, be that aspirational drives, be that terrorist actions or whatever. And basically, if you can apply this to a population at large or to an individual, it breaks down the psyche. And this is what the shock troops would do. They would go out and basically entrain world leaders and blue chip stock owners and company owners, CEOs, and that type of thing, to get this sort of ideology running through their various systems. And again, the fundamental belief is that if you can traumatize people sufficiently, then they will do two things. They'll freeze up and go to a fight or flight mode, by which they can be more easily programmable. If somebody's in a very, very sort of heightened experience, you can manipulate them very, very easily. And the second thing is that basically in all these circumstances, people want to a figure of authority. And it's not always the case that the figure of authority is the person that has the best interests of mind. You know, we live in what we assume is a meritocracy in a society whereby the people who've got the tough and ziggurat are there because they bloody well know what they're doing and they deserve to be there. And it's just simply not the case in numerous instances. But again, that mechanism, that assumption, that sort of societal norm can be very, very heavily manipulated by people in order to, again, to make you feel helpless, or to make you feel that essentially you don't have the ability to make decisions, or to function, or to self-determine your own life.
Correct in that he used one of the experiments he used on soldiers was sodium thiopental, and that was
using everything, uppers, downers, like screamers, like anything they could get their hands on. Like the drugging was actually more William Sargent. Like he took that and really sort of ran with it, and was then known at St Thomas's Hospital to give people what he described as Herculean doses, and he would eventually sort of get into the realm of putting people into sort of drug-induced comas for like months at a time, combining this with electroshock and various other methods, quackery essentially, and it would completely destroy people. It would strip them of any sort of social cognitive functions, any personality that they had, any memories. It would completely strip them out. So yeah, they were definitely using all sorts of drugs. And a lot of the time, again, these people were in catatonic states. It wasn't hugely removed from the experiments that Mengele and people were doing in Auschwitz, and in Dachau. They were doing sort of chemical experiments to try and basically break the will of man again. So again, this constant theme of utilization of control. And I think that again, that's the sort of the theme that would connect me, is it's essentially what we call the pharmacological method, and it's in what Aldous Huxley spoke about. It depends entirely what your utilization of psychiatry or psychology is. I'm not going to say psychiatry or psychology is evil. Has it been used for evil purposes? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it totally has. But it very much boils down to who, how, what, when, and why they're using it. What is their actual sort of purpose? Whether, again, you've got a good therapist, whether you've got somebody that is trained or funded enough to make a difference. So, but again, the problem with this is that there's hundreds and hundreds of scenarios where basically you can go throughout the history of all these disciplines and go, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong. Going back to your sort of earlier point, eugenics and psychology, are they connected? Not really, but eugenicists have used psychology to justify their eugenics, and psychologists have used eugenics to justify their psychology. And so this is the problem. You're getting into areas sometimes where people feel that the ends justify the means, or that they are superior to others, and so in their mind these actions are perfectly legitimate.
I have something to say about that. I did some studying on religious cults. I was actually in a religious cult before I entered the mental health system. I was 21 years old at the time they entered the cult. And then I did a paper on religious cults. And what I did was a study on how brainwashing happens. I had not yet entered the mental health system. I barely knew what therapy was. So what happened was I studied brainwashing. And I learned that it is done via kindness in the cults. It is not done by cruelty. And that's what happened to me in the cult. They told me how much they loved me.
Yeah.
And they told me how what a great person I was. And of course, it was a method of coercion. It was a method to get me to join. And that's exactly what they did in the mental hospital. They told me, come to us for help. We'll help you. Come to us. You've come to the right place. Of course, they were very nice at first. And what they do is they knock down the current ideology. You really couldn't cope well out there. You weren't doing well. Getting straight A's, it was just too much for you. It was perfectionism. It was a disease to get straight A's. You were just working too hard. It wasn't true, but they knocked me down. It was so hard, wasn't it? It wasn't.
Yeah.
But they do it by kindness. And then they replace that with, you have a disorder. You need our treatment. It's a permanent. Then they replace it with a new ideology. And then the brainwashing is complete when you've adopted their new ideology. I have a disorder. I will need treatment for the rest of my life. And that's the new ideology.
That's not strictly true, because there's lots of disorders that don't need treatment for the rest of your life. Again, I think that distinction is made between good and bad therapists and people who are actually just out to make you money.
Sadly, what they did was they decided that I had schizophrenia completely arbitrarily.
Right.
Completely arbitrarily. So I did believe that I needed treatment for the rest of my life. They said, you don't have depression. You're not depressed enough.
You go to a bad
you're
doctor,
not this, you're not that, you're not that.
Okay.
But there are plenty of bad doctors out there.
Yeah.
And sadly,
but then if you got brain
they
tumor,
defaulted
you
to
go to a different doctor because basically the previous one was crap with your foot.
Unfortunately, what happens is, when you're handed a patient, you're told that patient has schizophrenia, what are you going to do? You're going to not believe anything the patient says, and that's exactly what happened.
That's not true at all. That would be an incredibly poor therapist that did that.
Sadly, I was handed to the next one, and the next one didn't believe I had schizophrenia. He called me bipolar. Why? Right. He called me bipolar. I was called that. Then I had shock treatments. Then I was called schizoaffective. I was handed like that, handed from one to the next to the next.
Yeah, it sounds like
34 years. 34 years.
All right, guys. All right, you're arguing here.
I'm agreeing. I think that's appalling. I think you've obviously had an incredibly poor experience. But
well, I would think that the next one would question the diagnosis. They never did. They already, I had them asking me if I was hearing voices. I said no, but it didn't matter. They constantly asked me if I heard voices. And when I started talking about human rights, instantly, of course, well, they always do it. They tell you you're paranoid, and that's what they did. Your paranoia is acting up.
Where I do agree with you is the cult aspect of it, because what any cult does is they offer you three things. They basically they tell you exactly how the world is, right? They tell you your position in the world, and they offer you a collective group. You're in a family, and so to an extent, this is utilized. It's ubiquitous. It's utilized in advertising. It's utilized to get people to buy a certain car. It's utilized to get people to buy a certain drug. And I think that the difference is that in America, it's at the moment, it's very, very different. They will advertise psychoactive drugs on the television, and basically they will treat medical disorders in America in a way that is, it's a market to be sold to. And so in that sense, I absolutely 100% agree with you that what they do is they say, hey, you want to be part of this club and everything will be all right, okay? And we'll offer you this solution. So I 100% agree with you on that one. And I can't speak for your personal experience because it sounds like you've had a horrible, horrible time of it, and you've dealt with obviously very, very, very bad people. But again, that's not, you can't tar the entire industry with the same brush. I'm a therapist. I'm a nice guy. I'll sit and chat with you. Like the guy
you're
that
defending the industry. You're defending the industry, and you're saying that so many of them are great. But I was in the industry for 34 years. I didn't see very many good ones.
No, it sounds like you had an appalling experience,
Well, yeah, but why were so few of them terrible? So few of them decent. Very few of them. I would say 90% of them did not know what they were doing.
Why. It's because basically, unfortunately, if you want to see a good therapist or you want to see somebody who's really, really, really good at it, you have to pay a lot of money because the National Health Service or the sort of industries, they don't provide the funding at all, and they don't provide decent people. Like, if you're worth your soul, you're not going to go and take a job as a counsellor at a school. You're going to go and charge 60, 70, 80 quid an hour in your own practice. And that is a terrible, terrible problem that is compounded again by the fact that basically, as you say, it's an industry. That's one thing I'll never defend, the industry, okay? But the people within it and can be very, very useful. But that I agree with, the industrial aspect of it, the mass drugging, the mass pharmacological answer to what is essentially, questions about the very nature of existence a lot of the time. That is where it totally falls down. Okay, there is an industry within psychiatry called anti-psychiatry. Okay, that basically rails against all the presuppositions of putting people in mental hospitals, drugging people and stuff like that. It is not a clear-cut definition, although, as you say, the industry would make it seem that it is. You got this problem, you take Zoloft. You've got this problem, you take Ambien. Okay, that's not therapy. That's catering to a manufactured need, and that I 100% agree with you. That's industrial, and that's terrifying, and it's nefarious, and it's bullshit. Okay. And that aspect, I 100% agree with you.
Could I? We're coming up to the hour now, and I thank you all very much for being involved. And I also want to give you all the chance to tell people before we go how they can follow the research and projects and activity that I know that you all do and are involved in passionately. So could I start with Neil, if you'd like to say when people can find out more about the work you do, how they can follow you and buy the books that you've done?
mindcontrol.com. My books are also available on Amazon, and they can get me on Facebook as well.
That's neilsandersmindcontrol.com, did you say?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Thank you. Julie, would you like to say what you're doing currently or what work you've done and how people can follow you?
Can't hear you.
Julie, your sound is...
Yep, sorry. Well, you can find my blog at juliemadblogger.com, juliemadblogger.com. I'm thinking right now of starting a new literary work that would involve having people contribute to it, short works, and compiling them. This would be an anthology. It would be in regards to the use of force in psychiatry. I have not opened up submissions yet, nor started a website, but this is pending. And starting a publishing company run by psychiatric survivors. This would be a new sort of business mode that I'm proposing. I'm talking to accountants about how it would work. Another thing, I had a radio station. I haven't been using it lately, but I still have it. Julie Mad Blogger Radio. I'm open for doing more interviews of people. Would love to interview any of the folks that were on here today. I've interviewed Daryl. I'm very, very active in the Toastmasters program. I love to do public speaking, open mics any chance I can get. I've written books, published them. They're now up. One of them is available for free on right on my blog. My ECT testimony to the FDA is available for free on my blog. It's 28 pages that I wrote in 3 days up from my blog. I literally write thousands of words a day because I can and because I like to do so. And I think doubly because my freedom to write was threatened, literally threatened by psychiatric quote unquote care. My psychiatrist told me I couldn't write anymore. So that makes me write even more fast and furious, and hopefully till the day I die.
Thank you, Judy. Christina, would you like to tell people how they can, what you're doing and involved in, and how people can follow what you do?
Right, so psychvictims.com is still getting created. Hopefully it'll be up in a few weeks. They're having issues with messaging and commenting. So that'll be a platform where people can finally get the evidence out there and the proof. So psych victims don't really have a voice. We often hear, the people are paid. I don't mean to be like rude about it, but I've been pretty rude about it before, is that since, there's this whole different hierarchy here between the professionals and then the victims. So the victims aren't getting heard, and then we only hear the victims that they want heard. So the ones that are, they've bought into the idea, even though they'll probably figure out later that they'll have like adverse effects from, maybe diabetes, like I've heard that before, digestive issues and all kinds of things from drugs, or just, they don't learn how to externalize and they can't talk to friends. And so they just talk to their counselor or their therapist or, what have you. And so another thing I've made it is motivationology.org. So it's not, I'm more friendly to the idea of consultants. I know that Julie also talked about motivation. I thought that was great. I think motivation's a better thing. It can't be manipulative, really. I mean, of course you could, I just don't find motivation manipulative. So I'm more friendly to the idea of coaches or mentors or consultants. I know that people have attacked me over the coaching thing because it costs a lot. But the issue is I think the foundation is wrong. So I tried to make a different theory of motivationology. So externalizing strengths, not weaknesses. And there's 32 tenets on there. I think some people, they did say that the tenets were very helpful one time. They called themselves a targeted individual person. So it is useful. And a lot of those people, they were affected by projects either directly or indirectly in some way. And so, and then the third thing I'm doing is Ruledy.com. So we're actually going to go for not putting on mental health ads or advertising or buying and selling services. So that's going to be a controversial thing, but I've already used Everyday Psych Victims Project as evidence. So that immediately makes people realize, okay, there's a problem with the advertising. The pull marketing strategy is took marketing. So we're not going to have that, and it's a social network. So hopefully people will be able to say these controversial things on there and will not get manipulated by psych research on their social media, by Facebook type people, and also not be basically manipulated. So upon that, I'm just trying to make this project, so hopefully they'll work together and you can go on there and tell your story. Feel free to get interviewed at any time. I might have an interview next week. And I think we need to change the whole foundation, and I challenge any psych victims to actually make their own alternatives and outside psychology and outside mental health, and maybe look towards more like motivation things or strengths and weaknesses, overcoming adversity, things that aren't, strangely, I feel like they're not getting used on psych victims because they're instead getting used on people already good or something. So you'll see consultants, they'll get paid a lot. And, we shouldn't have to do that. I think there should be a mixing and integration here of these two groups and realize that this punishment foundation is not good, and this spotlighting weaknesses instead of just like these are natural reactions for that person. So change the idea of normal to be normal with that person.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you for listening and following us. And I'm going to put the links in the descriptions under the video of all the guests today. So if you want to find out more and see what they're doing, there'll be more in the links in the description in the video, so you can follow our guests. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Daryl.